The most dangerous people in your life don't look dangerous. They don't slam doors or scream in your face. No, they do something much worse. They smile. Gently ask how your back is feeling and then slowly erode your sanity, one passive, aggressive sigh at a time. You ever walk away from a conversation feeling like your soul needs a shower, like someone just downloaded a virus into your nervous system through a compliment? That's not nothing. That's psychic trespassing. See, in old age, the battlefield isn't out there anymore. It's in here. It's emotional, invisible. And sometimes the person sitting across from you holding your hand is also feeding off your spirit like a well-dressed mosquito. But here's the trick. It doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like guilt, obligation, sentimentality. It feels like family. And before you know it, you're apologizing for things you didn't even do, trying to keep the peace and wondering when exactly your spine turned into a doormat. We don't talk about this because it's subtle, it's quiet. But that's how real damage happens, slowly and with a smile. So today we're going to name it. The 8 types of people who may not raise their voice but will absolutely raise your blood pressure, and what to do when you realize one of them is living rent-free in your emotional house. Let's begin. Type 1, the help me while I drain you person. Also known as the emotional leech, disguised as a victim. You ever notice how some people treat your kindness like a buffet? At first, they seem fragile, sensitive, deep, maybe even a little broken, which tugs at that soft part of you that still believes you can save someone with enough casseroles and patience. You offer comfort. You listen. You absorb. And slowly you disappear. This is not your classic manipulator. This one doesn't even know they're manipulating. They're not trying to hurt you. They're trying to survive the only way they know how, by outsourcing their emotional labor to anyone who still answers their calls. In Buddhism, we'd call this clinging. In psychology, it's emotional enmeshment. In plain English, they use your nervous system to mop up their mess. They project their pain, their shame, their old mother wounds right onto your face and then blame you for the weather. If they're sad, it's because you weren't supportive enough. If they're angry, it's because you said it wrong. You become a full-time character in a drama you never auditioned for. And here's the kicker, they really do think you're the only one who understands them. Which means you can't leave, because if you do, you're the villain. Not them. You. And so you stay. Out of guilt. Out of love. Out of fear that you're being selfish. And you tell yourself they just need support. But what they need is their own therapist, and what you need is your energy back. The older you get, the more dangerous this dynamic becomes. Not because they get worse, but because you get tired. You've got limited bandwidth in your 60s, 70s, 80s. You can't afford to spend it untangling someone else's emotional yarn pile every week. You came here to live, not to host a psychic Airbnb. So the next time someone collapses into your lap with a soft voice and a long list of invisible emergencies, ask yourself gently but firmly, is this mine to carry? If the answer is no, then stop lifting. Type 2, the mask wearer who forgot. They had a face, also known as the persona addict. You've met them. You may have even been them for a little while. They're always polite, always pleasant, never a hair out of place or an opinion too sharp. Their house smells like lemon cleaner. Their emotions Febrezed. They smile at the funeral. They nod through betrayal. You say, "How are you really?" And they reply, "I'm just grateful." This is the person so deeply attached to their social mask they've forgotten there was ever a real face underneath it. In psychology, we call it over-identification with the persona. In Buddhism, it's clinging to form. In your grandma's words, she's nice, but there's something off. At first, they seem admirable, composed, a beacon of maturity, but spend enough time with them and you start to feel like you're speaking to a polite hologram. Every conversation becomes a staged performance. No risk, no mess, no honesty. Just rehearsed lines from the role they're still auditioning for, even though the show's been cancelled since 1986. The danger isn't in the mask itself. We all wear masks. It's in believing the mask is who you are. And here's where it gets sneaky. Because when someone clings to their polished persona, they expect you to do the same. You show a real emotion, they flinch. You say something messy or vulnerable, they change the subject. Because your authenticity reminds them of everything they've buried under politeness and pie recipes. They don't just hide their truth, they recruit you to hide yours too. Over time you start shrinking, not because they told you to, but because something in the air says, don't make a scene. And so the friendship, the marriage, the family dinner becomes a polite little play. Same script, same actors. And no one remembers the plot anymore, the tragedy. These people are often the loneliest. Not because others avoid them, but because no one knows who they are, including themselves. So if you're talking to someone and everything feels smooth, but nothing feels alive, you might be at a dinner party with their mask. And if you're the one smiling through 1,000 tiny deaths every day just to keep it together, it might be time to misplace the mask. Type 3, the pressure cooker in human form. Also known as the one who calls it self-control, but you know it's a bomb. They're composed, quiet, measured. You spill your soul, they blink twice. You cry, they hand you a tissue, like it's a medical form. You might think, wow, they're so calm. No, my friend, they're not calm, they're compressed. This is the person who treats emotional expression like it's a plumbing leak. You'll never see them angry until you really see them angry. And by then they're flipping out because someone moved their chair 2 inches to the left. In Buddhist psychology, this is pure aversion, resistance to what is. They've banished every ugly emotion into the basement of their psyche. Anger down there. Jealousy down there. Bitterness, regret, that one thing from 1973 locked in a trunk, wrapped in duct tape, buried under a pile of rosaries and tax forms. They don't just repress their shadow, they've installed soundproof walls around it. And the older they get, the thicker those walls become. But nothing buried stays quiet forever. Here's how it works. They'll be fine for weeks, months, even years. Then one day someone forgets to say thank you, and suddenly you're dealing with a Category 5 meltdown about how no one ever appreciates what I do. You're just standing there with a teacup, wondering what century this trauma came from. People like this are often admired. They're called stoic, disciplined, strong. But strength without softness, that's just emotional constipation. And the impact on those around them, you start tiptoeing, watching your tone, hiding your real feelings. Because you know, one wrong move could trigger a historical reenactment of every unspoken grievance they've had since Clinton was in office. The truth is, repressed emotions don't die, they ferment, they become sharp, bitter, and explosive. And if someone's spent a lifetime avoiding their own shadow, guess what you become? The unlucky screen it gets projected onto. If you're living with a pressure cooker, don't poke it. But don't pretend it's a flower pot either. Name the heat, set boundaries, and know this peace isn't silence. Peace is not being terrified that silence might suddenly start screaming. Type 4, the morality warden in your living room. Also known as the guilt distributor with a smile. This one doesn't yell. They don't manipulate directly, they do something far more sophisticated. They correct you politely, righteously, and with the full weight of the 10 Commandments, 4 Buddhist precepts, and 3 Reader's Digest articles behind them. At first glance, they seem like a person of high standards, spiritual, disciplined, principled. But if you spend enough time with them, you'll start to notice their morality always seems to apply to you. You go for a second slice of pie, they mention cholesterol. You say you're skipping church this Sunday. They sigh and say, well, I guess not everyone finds peace in tradition. Their whole energy is like a perfume made of subtle disapproval and lemon-scented superiority. What's happening here isn't about ethics, it's about control. In Buddhist terms, this is ego wrapped in virtue, clinging to an image of being the good one, the spiritual one, the right one. It's not compassion, it's costume. And the trap for you start shrinking yourself to fit their moral furniture. You stop speaking freely. You feel guilty for laughing too loud, for relaxing, for being human, because everything fun, flawed, or spontaneous becomes a concern. This is especially tricky in families. The elder who uses tradition as a weapon. The parent who says, after everything I've done for you, right before dropping a Bible verse and refusing to pass the potatoes, you end up feeling like you're on trial every time you visit. And the courtroom, it's scented with cinnamon and shame. They'll say it's love, they'll say it's guidance, but it's not. It's projection of the parts of themselves they don't want to face, their own envy, resentment, regret, dressed up as concern for your soul. So if you find yourself constantly explaining, apologizing, or adjusting who you are just to avoid getting the look, you might be living in someone else's moral prison. And here's the Buddhist truth. Virtue without awareness is just ego in a fancy hat. Take off the hat. Or at least stop letting other people put it on you. Type 5, the emotional landmine that thinks you're the enemy, also known as the past trauma puppeteer. You say nice shirt. They hear you've always been a disappointment. You ask want tea or coffee, and somehow you're accused of trying to control their life. Welcome to life with the complex-driven reactor. A person who's not responding to you, they're reacting to the ghost of someone who hurt them in 1982. This person doesn't live in the present. They live in a psychological haunted house where every door creaks open into a fresh betrayal. Their body's in the room, but their mind is still in that breakup, that childhood that one time their aunt forgot their birthday and the world collapsed. You never know what will set them off. A word, a look, a memory you didn't know they had. And suddenly you're in an emotional car crash, airbags deployed, and all you said was, pass the salt. In Buddhist psychology, this is classic samskara, unhealed mental imprints that replay themselves like reruns on a cursed channel. And in elderly psychology, these patterns deepen with age if they go unexamined. By the time someone's 70, they might not just have a complex, they might become one. The worst part, it's not constant. Sometimes they're lovely, charming, generous, the life of the potluck. And then boom, emotional detonation because you reminded them of their third-grade gym teacher. You end up in survival mode, measuring every word, hiding your truth, apologizing for triggers you didn't even know existed. And like a frog in boiling water, you don't realize how much of yourself you're losing until you can't remember the last time you felt relaxed around them. The truth, it's not your job to fix their past. You weren't there. You didn't cause it. You are not the emotional janitor for someone else's inner war zone. If someone's trauma is driving the car, it's okay to get out and walk. Let them have their ghosts. You've got enough on your plate like staying sane. Type 6, the psychic vampire who just wants to talk, also known as the energy leech with excellent timing. They never raise their voice. They don't insult you. They don't throw a single dish. But somehow every time they leave your house or your phone, you feel like a balloon someone sat on. This is the psychic vampire. The person who feeds not on your food or your money, but on your attention, your time, and your emotional oxygen. They don't want your presence. They want your presence of mind, and they want all of it. They usually show up at the exact wrong moment. You're settling into bed, or enjoying a quiet morning tea, and the phone rings. Hey, do you have a minute? And suddenly that minute turns into 45, and you're emotionally knee-deep in a story about how their neighbor's cat gave them a dirty look, and what that probably means about society. In Buddhism, this is the hunger realm, endless craving, endless dissatisfaction. In elderly psychology, it's often a symptom of emotional dependency, someone who never learned how to self-soothe, so they latch on to others like emotional life rafts. You try to help, but there's no bottom to the well. You validate, reassure, support, and still they're starving. Because it's not about the problem, it's about keeping you in orbit. And they're so good at it, they're masters of guilt-flavored conversation. I just don't have anyone else who understands me. You're the only one who really listens, which is another way of saying, please cancel your day and give me your nervous system. And here's the sneaky part, because they're not mean, You feel selfish for needing space. You start to believe that your boundaries are a character flaw. They don't set fire to your house. They just leave all the lights on and make you pay the emotional power bill. So here's your spiritual permission slip. You don't have to answer every call. You don't have to be the emotional landfill for someone who refuses to compost their own pain. Give from overflow, not from depletion. Because the more drained you become, the less of you there is left to live the life you actually came here for. Type 7E, the nostalgia cult leader. Also known as the back in my day emotional dictator, they don't carry a weapon, they carry a decade. Usually the 1950s, sometimes the 70s, whichever one had no Wi-Fi and more emotional repression. This is the person who weaponizes the past like it's a golden age religion. Every conversation somehow leads to how things were better back then, simpler back then, or how you kids ruined everything with your oat milk and boundaries. Their memory is selective, sacred, and slightly edited. They don't remember the Cold War or the lead paint. They remember community values, warm casseroles, and when people knew their place. In Buddhism, this is classic clinging to impermanence. In psychology, it's called time displacement, when the present is too uncomfortable, so the mind sets up permanent residence in the past. And in real life, it's exhausting. At first, they sound harmless, just reminiscing. But the deeper you go, the more you realize nostalgia isn't just a mood, it's a control tactic. You try to talk about your struggles, and suddenly you're being told, in my day, we didn't have anxiety, we just got on with it. You try to make changes in your life, and they bring up how your cousin Sheila followed tradition and ended up just fine. Here's the trap, because their nostalgia is dressed up as wisdom. It's hard to challenge without looking ungrateful. But their wisdom isn't about truth, it's about emotional superiority based on a heavily curated fantasy of the past. They use how it used to be as a way to shame how it is now. You start to feel guilty for adapting, for evolving, for not wanting to wear beige and go silently into the void. But let's be clear, honoring your past is beautiful. But building a psychological altar to it and demanding everyone worship there, that's not wisdom, that's tyranny in slippers. So the next time someone says, things were better back in my day, try replying, that's great, but I live in this day, and it deserves my presence too. Type 8, the spiritual escapist, who thinks they're already enlightened. Also known as the guru who can't handle a Tuesday. This person has transcended suffering. Just don't ask them to take the trash out. They've read every sacred text. They quote Rumi Lao Tzu and a monk I once met in Bali who may or may not have been a bartender in robes. Their chakras are aligned, their language is non-dual, and their relationships are an absolute train wreck. You see, they're not interested in working through conflict, they're above it. They don't apologize, they release expectations, they don't ghost people, they remove their vibrational mismatches. In Buddhist terms, this is spiritual bypassing, using spiritual ideas to avoid real human messiness. In psychology, it's dissociation dressed up as inner peace. In real life, it's someone who wants enlightenment without ever doing the laundry. They'll tell you suffering is an illusion while quietly leaving others to suffer for their responsibilities. You bring up a real-world issue, money, health, boundaries, and they float off into a cloud of detachment. All is as it should be. Oh, is it? Because the dishes in the sink are saying otherwise. Here's where it gets dangerous. They use oneness as a way to erase accountability. They can't have wronged you because we're all just mirrors, right? If you're upset, it's your karma, your story, your shadow. They're just holding space. From 200 miles away, and in older age, this gets even trickier. Aging can be a beautiful path towards spiritual maturity, or a way to spiritually check out. Some folks replace self-reflection with incense. They stop growing, but call it stillness. So how do you spot this archetype? Look for someone who calls themselves enlightened but hasn't spoken to their family in 6 years and insists it's because they're free of attachments. True wisdom is humble. It shows up, it listens, it takes care of the damn dog even when it's raining. So yes, we're all spiritual beings having a human experience. But if your enlightenment can't survive an awkward conversation, a late bus, or your adult kid asking for help, then maybe it's time to descend from the mountain and get back into the kitchen. Because presence isn't just in meditation, it's in showing up when it's inconvenient. So here's the kicker. You haven't just met these people, you've been some of them. At different points in life, especially the long, twisty ones we've all drained, someone else's energy clung to the past, hidden behind a smile, or quoted a little too much spiritual fluff to avoid saying, "I'm scared." That's not a flaw. That's being human. The problem isn't that we have shadows, it's when we pretend we don't. That's when the real danger begins. Not because we're evil, but because we're unconscious, recycling our wounds into everyone else's living room. In Buddhism, we don't get rid of our suffering by ignoring it. We bring it into the light, gently, with humor, with honesty, with the courage to say, yeah, sometimes I am the emotional landmine, sometimes I'm the vampire, but today I see it. And that seeing, that's freedom. Because the real practice, especially as we grow older, isn't escaping people who are unconscious. It's becoming someone who no longer gets pulled into their orbit. It's drawing boundaries with love. Saying no without guilt, laughing when the drama shows up, and not offering it a chair. So let others carry their ghosts. You've earned the right to walk lightly. And remember, awareness doesn't mean being perfect. It means waking up just enough to stop handing your peace to people who never asked for it.